Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to New Books in Drugs, Addiction, and Recovery. My name's Claire Clark. I'm one of the hosts of the channel. And today I'm talking to Benjamin Breen about his new book, Tripping on Utopia, Margaret Mead, the Cold War, and the Troubled Birth of Psychedelic Science, which was just published by Hachette in January 2024. And we are so excited to have Ben on the show. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could begin our interview by telling us a little bit about your career leading up to this book.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. But one thing that might be relevant is I've always been interested in 20th century medicine, and I honestly don't know why. It's just been there in my life since I was a kid. And it was sort of a through line in my first book research, which was about the really kind of a cultural and intellectual history of the drug and medicine trade in the early modern period. It grew out of my dissertation, which I wrote at UT Austin. And so it wasn't pure history of medicine, but it was very much involving medical products. And it sort of I think that really the interests, the connecting tissue between both of those two books is the question of how the desire to heal, the desire to cure disease, and the kind of beneficent or like benevolent goals associated with that can come up against all kinds of not just barriers to that desire, but actually forms of assertion of power. You know, the first book was about drugs and empire, right? So how imperialism shaped the global drug trade and vice versa. And I think in some ways this 20th century history that I'm telling in this book is a continuation of that interest in medicine and power and how society both changes in response to changes in medical technology, and also how medical technology can change society in ways that are both good and bad. So I feel like that's been a through line in my life that I don't really know why. I've just always been interested in it. And one other thing I can mention is my doctoral advisor, Jorge Cañizares-Esquerra, is actually, before he was an historian, he was actually a medical doctor. So even though he doesn't think of himself as an historian of medicine, I just want to give a shout out to Jorge for being almost an accidental mentor in that field, because he is trained in medicine. And so I've always been interested by that combo of, you know, sort of like you. I mean, someone who's people who are involved in the medical field in various ways, not just as physicians and historians. And actually, just before we started recording, Oliver Sacks came up, but I've always loved Oliver Sacks. And so I feel like that was also on my mind, that kind of the stranger byways and the more extreme or unusual examples of medical practice has always been of interest.
Well, he's an amazing writer, as are you. And this is just a beautifully crafted piece of writing, in addition to being a really rigorous history. So let's get into it. Tell us, how did you come to write Tripping on Utopia? I feel like Margaret Mead is a very daunting topic. I talked to Elena Conis about her most recent book, which deals with Rachel, also won the Welsh Medal, like your first book did, and that deals with Rachel Carson. And she was like, "Oh my gosh, so hard to like figure out an angle on a subject that is so complex and well documented." So how did you get into Margaret Mead?
It's a good question. I didn't really intend to when I started the story. There was a version of this book which could have just been more of an institutional history of psychedelic medicine. I was really interested in the Macy Foundation conferences, which is something that Margaret Mead was really entangled with and close to in the 40s and 50s. But there could have been another version of this book that was really in which Margaret Mead was a character, a figure, but not as centered. And really part of why that happened was in the process of researching in her archive, I just became truly amazed by the scale of the archive and the complexity of what was in it, and the degree to which large swaths of it appear not to have really been, used by historians. Like it's simply such a large archive that it just hasn't fully been documented, or I think, read. I don't think Margaret Mead had read her entire archive. It's basically physically impossible to do. It's one of the largest personal archives anyone I've spoken to has ever heard of. And I talked to Peter Mandler, who's an historian who wrote a really great book called Return from the Natives, which is kind of a Cold War angle on Margaret Mead's life in the 40s. And it's an excellent book. And he and I were talking about how there's basically material for like dozens of dissertations and books in that one archive alone, because she herself was so brilliant, but also such a talented organizer of people that really Margaret Mead was kind of like a team of people working under the name Margaret Mead. She was like a institution of her own. And so her archive is kind of like an institutional archive. It has, dozens of authors within the umbrella of the Mead archive, and many thousands of contributors in the form of correspondence and so forth. So I think the book kind of grew out of that first exposure to Mead's archive at the Library of Congress, and the realization that there's just amazing riches there that have not been written about. And then the other thing was, why did I write about psychedelic science in the first place? That's a combination of the an enormous amount of enthusiasm being directed at the field, especially, now we can talk about, maybe now it's changing a bit, but when I started conceptualizing this project in like 2017, 18, and 19, it was really the beginning, or maybe the coming into its own of the psychedelic renaissance, as it's called. The term had been coined a bit earlier, but I believe Michael Pollan's book came out, let's see, How to Change Your Mind, 2018, I think. May 2018. And so that was kind of like the inflection point for this whole kind of emergence of psychedelic science, reemergence, as a major cultural force, I would say. And it sort of tied in with my own interests in psychedelics. I have a personal interest in the topic that's pretty longstanding. I also have a personal kind of exposure to both the good and bad sides, you might say, of psychedelic experiences. So I felt like I was kind of in a place in my life and a moment in time where there was an interesting story to be told, and I think an important story to be told about the ambiguities and the complexity of what psychedelics were, and in such a way as to inform what psychedelics can be now. And so I was trying to kind of intervene in that moment of the psychedelic renaissance by telling a story about the past. And it just so happened that Margaret Mead's archive was one of the untold or untapped riches in that archive had to do with psychedelics. And so it was just kind of a convergence of looking around in many different archives. I looked through more than a dozen personal papers and interviewed, I think, something like 30 people. And so it could have gone a different direction, but I just kept circling back to Mead because her archive was unbelievably cool. It was just amazing to read it. And she herself was so, I think, such an embodiment of the complexity of the story I wanted to tell. I mean, she was brilliant. She was very well-meaning. In many ways, she was an admirable person, but as many anthropologists and historians of anthropology have documented, there was also a lot of, shall we say, like aspects of her life that looked problematic or troubling with hindsight. And there's a lot about her role in science and in society that has to do with the theme of good intentions gone awry, or good intentions which do not fully live up to their intended goal. And that, to me, is really the story of psychedelic science as a whole, especially in the 50s and 60s. And so I just kind of saw her as like both a fascinating person in her own right, but also as like an entryway into this larger group of people who all collectively became the story that I told.
One of the things that I love about history as a discipline is sort of how humble the arguments can be, that they're unlike, I feel like, philosophers can get kind of overblown sometimes. And historians will say, they'll tell you, between X year and Y year, something happened, or you think the beginning of something was X, but actually it was Y. And so this book is the birth of psychedelic science. It's an origin story, and essentially that's the historical contribution that it makes. It's like you think when psychedelic science started, but it started way before that. And let me show you what that origin looked like. So I wonder, could you tell our audience a little bit about what is the origin story of tripping on utopia?
Yeah, and this is one of the things I love about history too. Is that it's just sort of like we were talking about how I have a 2.5-year-old. My wife and I have a toddler at home who's always asking, "Why is that?" What are the classic toddler questions? Like, why did it get that way? And then they keep kind of asking about origins of things. And I like how history lets you keep asking that question for the rest of your life, basically.
Yeah,
What
yes.
I've been doing.
Very good. Yeah.
It also gives you a very good toolkit for thinking through the pitfalls of asking that question. And one of the key ones is this term that I always teach to my students on the first day of class, anachronism, meaning something which is ahistorical. If you go back in time to ancient Rome and you start talking about um, uh, being an electrical engineer, that's anachronistic. They have no idea what you're talking about. It does not make sense in their cultural universe. The term doesn't exist, but the material culture around the term does not exist either. And it's important to highlight that the word psychedelic is from the late 50s, and it doesn't become in wide use until, right around 1960, 61. And so in pushing backward the story of psychedelic science, I'm not trying to argue that psychedelics as a coherent conceptual category in medicine or in culture existed earlier. At the same time, and this is something I touched on in my first book research, but a lot of other people, historians of the colonial period and anthropologists of pre-Columbian Americas in particular, have talked about, there are cultures of usage of what we now call psychedelics that go back many thousands of years, actually stunningly deep in time, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years in the distant past. There's evidence of the use of ayahuasca and peyote, and also psilocybin mushrooms in pre-Columbian cultures of Mexico, Central America, and South America. So that's always kind of there in the background of when we talk about psychedelics and psychedelics as a form of healing. But I noticed when I was reading on the topic and just talking to people that there's always seemed like there was kind of a jump, right? There's the indigenous history of use, which is, it deserves to be more widely known, but it's not like people aren't studying that. It's been documented for quite a while, and people are currently actively working in the field quite a bit. And then there's, Timothy Leary and the whole story of psychedelics in the 60s. Michael Pollan did a pretty good job, I thought, of excavating aspects of the 1950s story. And others too. There's been like several books. Ido Hardhuxon, American Trip is a really good book on the topic. But they all kind of took specific angles. They looked at like specific figures, or they asked specific questions. And I was really interested in the origin as the theme, as you mentioned. One of the things that I found is that if you are willing to let go of tracing the concept of psychedelics back, because like I said, it's the late 50s, but if you push back to what those people who originated that concept in that field were doing in the 40s, you see a very clear through line with these earlier fields, which I had never heard of. Like the term narcosynthesis meant nothing to me when I started researching this book. And I think it's an unbelievably interesting and I think important failed subfield of psychiatry. It doesn't exist anymore. You can't find a narcosynthesist or someone who will do it as a form of treatment anymore. It basically got replaced by psychedelic therapy. But this concept of using, this is a field that emerged in the late 30s and especially during World War II became quite significant. It was using sedative drugs as a form of basically sped up Freudian talk therapy was originally how it was conceived of. It was used on soldiers who had been traumatized in battle in World War II as a way to kind of get them to process repressed memories and trauma within a matter of hours, supposedly, as opposed to days or weeks. And that was really interesting to me to see that kind of wartime context of a form of drug-assisted psychotherapy, which truly does directly inspire psychedelic therapy because it's the same people doing both in many cases. And it's like literally the same group of people. And this is one of the reasons the Macy conferences became of interest, because that was one of the through lines linking the World War II era proto-psychedelic researchers, we might call them, to the famous names in the field in the 50s and 60s. So that was one interest. But then the other was one of the reasons why Margaret Mead was of such central importance in the story is that anthropologists have this very underrated role to play in connecting the indigenous histories of not just psychedelic use, but of altered states of consciousness to the 20th century history of altered consciousness. And so that was, I thought, a huge missing piece of the story that Margaret Mead embodied, but many other people did too. It was like a whole group of anthropologists in the US, but also in Mexico, Brazil, and other countries who were directly involved in both studying non-Western cultures of altered states of consciousness and involved in the early history of psychedelics.
Yeah, I want to circle back to Margaret Mead's archives, which, if they're stacked one on top of the other, would be as tall as a Manhattan skyscraper, is what your book says. In addition to combing through those archives, you and traditional printed sources, this book draws a lot on multimedia material, audio tapes, film. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your methods and how you handled tackling a subject that is associated with such voluminous primary and secondary source material and multimedia. I mean, you open the book by analyzing a painting.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just tell us a little bit about how. What was your process like in going through all of this?
It was a lot of fun, to be honest. That was by far the most fun part of this process, was just dealing with the scope and experiencing the scope of what's available as an archive. My experiences as a researcher for my first book and my dissertation were all just like, you go to a library, you go to an archive that's like, in some cases, I did a lot of research at the Portuguese National Archives, which are, very kind of stuffy. It's like you walk through like a little security guard area, you put your backpack in a locker, there's librarians, and it's all very institutional and it's very traditional. It's just like an old building with old documents. And it was so fun for this book because a lot of what was available was actually in the form of, it was in people's brains, right? People in their 70s and 80s and even 90s who are still alive, or were still alive when I spoke to them, who had memories of the 50s and 60s that had never before, as far as I could tell, been tapped by historians or kind of entered into the record. And I found that really, really beautiful, actually. I mean, I learned a lot about life from talking to these people, and I'm so grateful to the people who spoke to me, because it was just, on a human level, it was just fascinating to speak to people in their 80s and 90s about their youth, and to get their perspective on how they experienced it at the time, but how they look back on it now. So the practice of doing oral histories and interviews was new to me, and I found it to be life-changing. It was so interesting. And along the way, I ended up in a couple cases, there was personal papers that had not been entered into an archive that I was able to look through. So I'm very grateful to the people who let me into their homes to do that. I spent a day looking through the archives of a very influential early psychedelic psychiatrist, Oscar Janiger. His son was really kind and let me just look through them in his home. And he had like a little kitten standing on the boxes, staring at me as I was doing it. And so those are some really good memories. And it was really, by its very nature, it was the archives I looked at were mixtures of multimedia sources. Like they were photographs, videos, tape recordings, random notes, like handwritten notes, but then also scientific papers. I read quite a lot of scientific papers from the 50s in particular. And actually FOIA documents. So I had I had many FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests of the federal government, almost all of which were unsuccessful, which is just kind of how it works. But for a period of time during COVID, a very kind FOIA officer in the Office of Naval Research was literally going through, I think, dozens of boxes in a big warehouse somewhere, some Navy warehouse, where I just asked her, look for references to dolphins and LSD. And she would check in with me periodically and be like, I didn't find any, but I'm still looking. And, I mean, that was a really interesting experience, just to see the different ways that you can find and surface information. Also, well, in the process of doing this work, the CIA actually on its own made public a new set of documents that were relevant to the research. Like, they found even more MKUltra documents, I think in 2019, or at least they digitized them and made them publicly available. So I would just check the CIA FOIA website periodically and find new stuff. So it was kind of lucky, because during COVID, many people I know had to give up on doing research because it meant going to a physical archive. And in this case, because a lot of what I was using was interviewing people who happened to be stuck at home during COVID, so they were happy to talk, or FOIA requests, or finding weird documentary film footage I had never heard of. In some cases on YouTube, in other cases on library and historical archive websites. I was able to kind of supplement textual archival work with all this other stuff, and including I loved. I'm so grateful to Stanford University Archives, because they actually digitized two things which were really important for the book. One was the appointment books of a CIA consultant named George Hunter White, who's an important figure in the kind of infamous 1950s illicit drug testing, LSD testing in particular, on civilians by the CIA. They digitized these set of, I think, over 20 books, and shared them with me before they had been made public fully. And that was hugely helpful, because I found a lot of new material there. And they also digitized a couple crucial tape recordings from Allen Ginsberg's papers, which Ginsberg himself had recorded on a big reel-to-reel old-fashioned audio recording equipment. And that was so interesting, because it was I don't know, I just had this sort of spooky feeling of just accessing hidden knowledge, stuff that had not been available before. And I really loved the experience of researching this book. It was just so many different strange documents, strange people, and very, very helpful librarians and archivists. So I just want to say now how appreciative I am to them for helping me.
Oh, that reminds me of the research that I did for my dissertation and first book. I had a research process like that, where it was just beginning to end. All of the sources were fascinating, right? And you could spend a lifetime with them. So very cool. So Tripping on Utopia is, it's told chronologically. It's organized in 3 sections: the pattern, the project, and the noise. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the book's structure and what happens in each period.
Yeah, I tried out different forms for this, but one of the key things is that I wanted to tell it chronologically, because to me, the really revelatory aspect of this research was just how idealistic, specifically anthropologists, but also psychiatrists and people involved in biomedicine in general in the 30s and 40s were. Specifically in the 30s, there was this moment when it truly seemed to people as if before World War II broke out, there was a sense that maybe the world had experienced the war to end all wars. It wasn't called World War I in the 30s, right? The Great War, and so that kind of translated into this explicitly utopian framework for technology and science as a path to human uplift and a way of changing human nature for the better. So there's a book that I really relied upon a lot for this section of my book called Gods of the Upper Air by Charles King. Have you read that? That's
a great book.
Yeah.
It's so well. It's just a fun read. I mean, if you're interested in the history of ideas and just writing about the history of ideas, it's very accessible. And anyway, yeah.
I really recommend it. I love the book. And it helped me so much with getting Margaret, Mead and Bateson, Gregory Bateson, her third husband, who's a major figure in my book, intellectual context and understanding what they saw themselves as trying to do when they were, young people, who their training was coming from and who their mentors were, what that kind of world was that they were trying to participate in. And one of the things that Charles King does really well in Gods of the Upper Air is getting across how revolutionary and important it was to make a case for what is now called cultural relativism, but really I would just frame it as explicitly trying to combat the imperial mentality of Western science and medicine, which was inherited from the 19th century. So in the 19th century, science and medicine were completely entangled with scientific racism, early eugenics, and the whole colonizing project of, the white man's burden, this idea that one of the main tools of uplift of what in the 19th century was wrongly called primitive societies would have been scientists intervening and, training people, introducing the tools of Western science as a kind of almost the tip of the spear of empire. And so Margaret Mead, I reference that she can be controversial among anthropologists today, but Gods of the Upper Air does a really good job of showing her genuinely visionary and important contribution to pushing back on that legacy of scientific racism and the legacy of imperial science, and really trying to set up a new form of science which would be anti-imperial and anti-racist. And I talk about Ruth Benedict in my book, who is Mead's great mentor. She was also an important mentor of Gregory Bateson. Really, Ruth Benedict, Mead, and Bateson, I think, are kind of three of the most important figures in that project of combating scientific racism in the 20s and 30s specifically. And what they were trying to do was to create a pattern of culture. That's the name of one of the key books in this milieu of Boasian anthropologists, these early cultural anthropologists. And so I called that part the pattern because their work was about creating a coherent vision of human culture that was not beholden to the view that Western culture was superior. It was just trying to see all human culture as a vast pattern, every human being as like a tiny, thread within a Persian rug or a tapestry. And it's a beautiful concept, and I found it really appealing. Even as an historian, as a person, I realized it also is, we now would say, I think many historians of anthropology would say, it too is a product of imperial science. It's just the end of empire. And so there were still all kinds of, this has been called salvage anthropology because the idea was it was salvaging the remnants of vanishing cultures. So it had all kinds of problematic legacies of its own, which are actually, as we speak, currently being assessed a little bit in the context of the American Museum of Natural History. I've seen some criticism of those exhibits, which Margaret Mead helped create, right? So there's definitely a legacy of this new form of anthropology, which is now problematic as well, or being questioned. But in the 30s, it was really utopian, and it was really, I thought, an important intellectual project. So the first part of my book is establishing how psychedelic science and that vision of using altered states of consciousness as seeing them as part of the human experience and not as something that should be looked down upon, fit into that larger story of cultural anthropology and the sort of optimistic, idealistic mode of science in the early 20th century. The project, the middle part, is about the 50s. And in many ways, it's about how that starts to break down in the context of the Cold War as it becomes instrumentalized in the form of an actual set of therapies and set of, ideas which are brought into the real world. I used to call that section, originally that section was called Out of the Lab, because it's this idea that's now being applied in the world. The idea that altered states of consciousness and anthropological insights can be deployed in the 50s across the world in all kinds of different contexts to help save the world is the application of that utopian idea of science. But it's taking place in a very changed context after World War II, during the Cold War, during the Korean War specifically. And suddenly there's a lot of difficult ethical choices that confront these researchers as they move from abstraction to praxis, to actually trying to put this into the world. And then the final section is how it all breaks down. And that was the more familiar story, that the story, I was trying to kind of give the story of Timothy Leary and the sort of Harvard psilocybin experiments and the more famous angle on psychedelic science, to make that the ending point rather than the beginning, and to see how it looked like from that earlier generation's perspective.
Right. Well, it's a very cool 3-act structure, and each of those sections is just fascinating and full of fascinating material. One thing that I thought was kind of curious about it was that although it definitely talks about sort of like the project of culture, Boasian cultural anthropology. You really don't get into the question of kind of structural racism in science and medicine until the book's final section, when suddenly it sort of explodes in these hearings in the 1970s. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how the question of Margaret Mead's legacy relates to histories of race, gender, and sexuality that are kind of the gender and sexuality is really woven throughout the book, but race doesn't really kind of come to a head until the end.
Yeah. And actually, anyone interested in this topic, I have a colleague at UC Santa Cruz, Mark Anderson, an anthropologist, who wrote a really good book called From Boas to Black Power: Racism, Liberalism, and American Anthropology. And so that's a really good take, including a take on Margaret Mead on this topic. And he too mostly focuses on the sort of 60s and 70s context. In my case, the main reason I was waiting until the final third to kind of deploy that as a factor in the story was because I was trying to really get at the experience and the thinking of these scientists at the time. And again, the question of anachronism. So one of the key things that comes across in Mead's work and her writing and in her whole social circle is that she saw herself as explicitly anti-racist and was really trying hard to be that throughout her life. And it came as a huge shock to her. And it was kind of a personal tragedy that she ended up losing, as she saw it, the young people. You know, she was obsessed with being young. She was obsessed with having young people like her. She said to her biographer that 12, her true spiritual age was 12 years old. And so she was a very young, older person, even into her 60s and 70s. And it was really one of the tragic things of her life that after, 1968 and after the kind of changes in culture and in academia in the late 60s and early 70s, she kind of found herself on the outside of that world, and in some cases was exposed to quite a bit of criticism, for instance, for collaborating with the U.S. State Department, U.S. government during the era of Vietnam. One of the key things is that Margaret Mead, when she's, for instance, early in my book, I show Margaret Mead was actually a very early and I think quite prescient and thoughtful anthropologist working on peyote. And this is not widely known because she mentioned it in her published work, but didn't write a standalone book on the topic. But she was thinking about writing a book on it. She has a lot of field notes about peyote use among the Omaha people in Nebraska as part of this larger continuum of peyote as a sacrament, which is used in the Great Plains and the borderlands between the U.S. and Mexico. And she studied this in 1930 in a climate in which peyote and the usage of peyote by indigenous Americans was hugely racialized and extremely, extremely controversial. So like the New York Times called peyote usage demonic and satanic in 1930 in the late 20s. It was there was repeated attempts to ban it at the federal level. It was viciously condemned by Christian groups in particular, but really by seemingly everyone that I could find. And it was framed in this extremely racialized context as, like a tool of the devil, a tool of savagery. That's a direct continuum from the 17th century, from the colonial period, that Margaret Mead was explicitly arguing against. She was saying peyote is not inherently bad. She was just making an obvious point that drugs are what you make of them. They don't necessarily even function as drugs, depending on the context. They can be religious sacraments. They can be medicines. They can be tools of spiritual or even just personal healing. And so she was saying this in her field notes and in her published work in 1930, and repeatedly kind of mentioned peyote throughout the rest of her life in a way that I thought was like very, very ahead of its time. So I wanted to show that she had in her younger years, in her 20s and 30s and 40s, really like quite a thoughtful perspective that was important and actually quite controversial, pushing back against the racialized approaches to how specifically how psychedelic and usage was envisioned in the West, but also altered states of consciousness more general, like trance states. And then in the 50s, as I get into in the book, she, in a Cold War context, gets very implicated in some really quite ethically problematic and troubling work sponsored by the U.S. government, not just in the field of psychedelics, but in all kinds of fields. She was into a lot. She was involved in a great number of different projects. And that kind of starts to catch up with her in the 60s, but especially her whole kind of milieu, people like Harold Abramson, who was like one of the key figures in MK Ultra, but also many other doctors and researchers in the mid to late 70s get exposed to, I think, justified scrutiny in the form of a series of hearings, Church Commission hearings and others, which highlighted violations of medical ethics. And often the people who were being experimented upon against their will or without their full knowledge were people of color. Also crucial to mention is many of them were institutionalized patients. So people in mental institutions in particular, but also people in prisons and jails. So that's entangled with the history of race, but also the history of class and gender. And it's really one of the tragedies of Mead's life, but also of the people she worked with, that in their youth, many of them had been really idealistic and motivated by this goal of making science, explicitly anti-racist forms of science, that then in the 50s and 60s, it gets very complicated. And that's one of the recurring things in the history of science and medicine, that there's a generational moment. There's that saying that science progresses one funeral at a time or something. And that's kind of true about medical ethics as well. It was so striking to me how the people who were the self-perceived good people on the right side of history in one decade could 2 decades later become the bad ones, the people who were being condemned. And so I was trying to show that story in a way that didn't involve me casting blame or condemning. I was just trying to kind of show it as best I could as it happened, as it played out chronologically. And that's why I kind of waited until the revelations came to really center that in the story itself.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's done so skillfully, just taking the reader through the different periods, and really for our listeners, it's in engaging but dispassionate way. I asked Ben in email before we started, before we got into the interview, how he dealt with such sensational subject material. And it does seem like with this book that there's like this structure where the end of every chapter, or almost, many chapters, is sort of a fresh revelation. And I won't say all of them because I don't want to give too many spoilers, but you've already mentioned the dolphins getting LSD. That's one. And the creation of the CIA that we've touched on is another one. But how did you handle this material, the desire to fully convey the sort of weirdness of the story that you tell, with a historian's obligation to kind of tell it straight?
Yeah, I actually it's funny, it never really occurred to me until now, but I took some inspiration from the TV show Mad Men, which I thought was really brilliantly done, where it seems like it's a straight ahead story of people in a business context in the late 50s and early 60s, but that's actually a really deeply weird TV show. And it explores all kinds of complex psychological terrain and strange.
I'm a huge Mad Men fan, and was obsessed. It was on the whole time I was writing my dissertation and first book. Absolutely obsessed with it.
Yeah. I rewatched it as I was writing this book, and I won't give away the final scene in Mad Men, but very relevant to this book. And that was part of like my main background, kind of, I don't know, it was just kind of on in my head thinking through that world. I wanted to capture the weirdness of mid-century, specifically the mid-century United States, but really the mid-century world. Growing up, I was born in the 80s. It was always portrayed by my parents, because they were kids then, as, like Leave It to Beaver in this very conventional world. And I knew that from talking to people, like my wife is from Iran. So that's a very American-centric way of seeing the 50s, right? The 50s was actually a period of huge upheaval and change for most people in the world. So I already knew that intellectually, but it was so striking to me how even the people in that, living in the New York suburbs, let's say in the 1950s, were living very, very strange lives in some cases. So Harold Abramson is a main figure in my book. He's on the cover sitting to the right of Margaret Mead at one of the Macy conferences. I had mentioned that he's a psychiatrist, but he's also one of the central figures in the MK Ultra project of LSD testing funded by the CIA. Really mysterious and interesting character. And one of the things that struck me is he literally gives an interview to Time magazine about LSD in the mid-50s, where he says that he has dinner parties where he gives it to his friends, And actually, Gregory Bateson is one of them. Gregory Bateson stops by his house in Long Island, and on a Friday evening over dinner, probably like pot roast or meatloaf or something, they do LSD together with a group of people. And in many ways, Harold Abramson is a very conventional man. He has, I think, 4 kids. He lives in the suburbs. He commutes into New York. He has a very kind of, his public profile is very like a conventional, disciplined, sort of serious-seeming physician character. But when you read his writing, it is just bizarre. Like the stuff he's speculating about with psychedelic therapy, the way he's framing his work, he sees it as saving the world. He sees himself as like a figure in the creation of a new unified science that will unite whole fields. And the work he's actually doing involves studying how LSD can be turned into a gas, which could be sprayed in a subway system or over a city from an airplane, just like crazy stuff, including like I found one memoir that was written by a army psychedelic researcher where he this is just this person's memoir. He just mentions, Harold Abramson was a very strange man. He once asked me if he could find like a kilogram, some huge amount of LSD. I forget the amount, but enough to like dose literally millions of people. Like basically a drum filled with LSD. And according to this researcher, James Ketchum, Abramson wanted to drop it in a pond to see how it would affect the aquatic life in the pond.
Oh my gosh.
And I don't know if that's true. Like I didn't, I included it in the book as like a little one-off, if that. I can't even remember if it's in there. But I didn't make that a claim I made because I couldn't verify it. But it's like a little illustration of the type of material I was finding in the archive. And so I just kind of followed it where it went. It was just deeply strange people and deeply strange material. And I tried to tell it straight. Believe it or not, I didn't even include the weirder parts, actually. But I really didn't. Like, there's some really significantly stranger stuff that I just didn't put in because I didn't want the book to veer off in too many strange angles. I'll give you one small example. Is I interviewed a guy who had been in a sort of, I don't know if he framed it as a cult, but kind of a spiritual seeking group, people who are kind of like believers in fringe spiritual theories in the 70s. And he ended up in a villa in Mexico alone with a pet jaguar that he had to just go and get meat from a butcher in the village and bring it back and feed. It was a jaguar or a leopard. I think it was a pet leopard. And so I talked to him for like an hour about this experience because it was tangentially related to one of the people in my book. But, I just got really into these stories because they had never been told before. And they were just so strange. And so I think illuminating of that Mad Men thing of like the 50s and early 60s was a lot weirder than we thought. And it's a lot more like creative and complex. And I think has a lot of resonance with the present in ways I didn't expect.
Yeah, well, it's great. You strike the balance and do a wonderful job with it. Were there you mentioned dissertations coming out of Margaret Mead's archive and stuff that was too weird to even be included in the book, but were there any stones left unturned or questions left unanswered in your research, like anything you came across and you're like, oh, there's another book in this?
Yeah, so much. I truly could spend the whole rest of my life writing about different angles on these topics. I had a ton of material on the drugginess of early anthropology, which I think is very interesting. There's so much going on with like late 19th century and early 20th century anthropologists and altered states of consciousness, which I had to cut. I had a whole chapter on technocracy, this strange techno-utopian movement in the 30s that, oddly enough, Margaret Mead was good friends with the founder of it. And she just mentions this in her biography, or in her memoirs, and kind of drops it, except again, she's a very kind of interesting and mysterious figure. Like, she mentions that she was asked to spy on this guy after World War II. She doesn't say by who. And I was just really curious about that. So I feel like someone should write a history of technocracy, and there's probably a lot in Mead's archive that would shed new light on it. And actually, I started a website with a little bit of funding from the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz here, where I am, called psychedelicarchive.com. And it's basically, the idea is that it's just a open, like, public domain, freely accessible archive of primary sources relating to the history of psychedelics. It's still under construction. I'm working with some undergraduate students here at UCSC to start fleshing it out. But one person I would draw attention to, who I think is very worthy and deserving of a full-on biographical study, and I think maybe more than one, is Betty Eisner, who's a very... I could have written this book with Betty Eisner at the center of it. It was just that her archive was very small, so I didn't really get insight into her personality very, very much. And her papers are at Stanford. They're interesting, but they're like literally like 1/1000th the size of Mead's archive, so I couldn't do as much with them. But she was an early psychedelic researcher in the 50s who led a very strange and complex life. In the 70s, she was accused of being kind of a cult leader, or like the leader of a kind of psychiatric group, which sort of became a cult of personality around her, it's been claimed. There was a death involving one of her patients. Her medical license was revoked. But now she's also, because she wrote a memoir, which is circulated online, called Remembrances. Let me double check the name. Remembrances of LSD Therapy Past. And if you actually just search that name online, you can find it. I linked to it on the Psychedelic Archive website that I just mentioned. It's so interesting because it's like her actual direct memories of that period. This is a self-published PDF that I think just showed up online before she died in the early 2000s. It's kind of rueful. It's a little bit melancholic. She clearly knows mistakes were made, but she does not come across as someone who is like, reckless or a cult leader or anything like that. She comes across as pretty thoughtful, actually. So I found her quite kind of compelling, and I still don't really know what to think about Betty Eisner. I didn't get to the bottom of that, what she was like as a person, but I think she's quite important. I feel like you could like make a TV show about her, like like, again, not just one book, but multiple books, because her life was, she was one of the first people to really develop LSD therapy. And there's many people like that, but specifically her stuck out in my mind as a complex person. And then others, Timothy Leary, I tried to withhold judgment in my book, but I do have to say that I found him to be quite a disagreeable personality. He was just sort of like not a very nice person, at least in the 50s and early 60s, from what I could see of his archive. But that's one of the things, is like his archive is also quite big, and I didn't feel like I scratched beyond the surface of his archive. I think there could be a new biography of him that would be interesting. Same with Ram Dass. A lot of room for biographies in this material. And also great documentaries could be made. Oh my God, there's so much interesting footage. It kept showing up when it keeps getting digitized. Like Gregory Bateson talking about LSD with Harold Abramson on TV. I didn't know that footage existed. It's now featured in a chapter of my book. It just showed up. San Francisco State University Archives just posted it during COVID at some point. And I was like, oh my God, this is so relevant to what I'm doing. I think there'll be more like audio, video, film footage like that getting digitized in the coming years, which may well add lots of other new dimensions to the story.
Well, that's great. Well, any documentarians listening, you should consult Ben if you've got documentaries in the works. I love the idea of the that's great that your institution is getting behind making a website to archive things. Very cool.
Yeah, and actually, just a shout out if anyone wants to contribute their own papers or their own memories, you just get in touch with me. You can find my email address maybe in the show notes, or if you just Google my name. It's not hard to find. And I would love to talk to people about like their parents' archival collections, or a lot of what I've been doing with this book project that I'd like to continue is just making publicly visible these kind of, stories. And also just want to flag that arrowwood.org is a really interesting resource for psychedelic history. I'm really grateful to what they've done. Do you know Arrowwood? Yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead.
I knew of them for a long time as like a trip report kind of repository, but they've done really interesting things with the history, of specifically this guy named Myron Stolaroff. They have their own little vault on Arrowwood. And so that's like if anyone who's interested in this topic, I recommend checking out the Arrowwood archives because they have a lot of interesting material that I could only find there.
Well, so we've made it to our traditional final question on the New Books Network, but it sounds you sound pretty busy with the archiving, and I know that you have 2 young kids, and and heck, you've already written 2 books, so maybe you want to take a break. But what our final question is, what are you working on next? Do you have any other major research projects in the pipeline?
Yeah, it's true that I'm trying to spend time with my kids in the short term, just because you can only get that once. You can't get it back. So that's really my goal for the rest of the year. But and also teaching and just doing my job as a professor here. But I do have this idea for a book about William James and his world in the 1880s and 1890s, and specifically the Society for Psychical Research, which was like a kind of like ghost hunting society. But they were also really interested. One of the arguments I like to make is that they were quite important in the emergence of a science of consciousness, the idea of the unconscious, the idea of science is something which can explore the mind in a deep way. And William James was a co-founder of the American branch of this society. He was a believer in psychic phenomena. He was really committed to it in this period of time, which also happens to be the period of time when I would argue the earliest information age begins, the age of telegraphs and phone networks and geopolitical communication that is like almost instantaneous, and so I'm really interested in like this idea of like a global consciousness emerging in scientific practice and in culture. Alongside this, again, it's a story of strange science, like the path science could have taken where it incorporates a little bit more of a view of the supernatural than it ended up doing, and a kind of an open-minded form of science, which doesn't fully seem to me to exist anymore. So I'm just interested in this weird kind of Victorian world of William James and his siblings and this society. I don't know what direction that will take, but I'm kind of having a lot of fun digging into that. I also have this idea for a project about the history of the idea of technological apocalypse, which would go back to the 17th century colonial world. The idea that human-made technologies can destroy ecosystems, can make species go extinct, can threaten human survival. Kind of the beginning of this concept, I think, goes back earlier than I thought. So again, it's an origin story that I'm going to look at, but that's going to take years, and I'm having a lot of fun just not writing at the moment.
Yeah, well, and you have earned it, and teaching and raising a family are that's what I've done. Just teach and raise my family and do New Books Network interviews for a couple of years. So, but if you pick the William James Project up, I'm a big William James fan. If you want to come on the show in another 5 or 10 or 15 years and talk about it, I'd be delighted to talk to you again.
That's cool to hear. Yeah, Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, all right. Well, this has been Benjamin Breen. His new book is Tripping on Utopia, Margaret Mead, the Cold War, and the Troubled Birth of Psychedelic Science.
Thank you so much. It was really fun to talk to you. I appreciate it.